Hello, and a very warm welcome to this podcast journal club with high performance papers from the University of Copenhagen, where I, Lars Nybo, is a professor in human physiology. And today I have with me here Magni Mohr, first author of what indeed qualifies for a high performance paper, match performance of high standard soccer players. Welcome to you, Magni.
Thank you, Lars.
And I have to say that even since I agreed with you to do this talk, I had to update, and the citation number has increased by a further 100 since that time, and it's only approximately a month ago. So this paper, which you did when you were a PhD student here at the university?
Yes. I did it during my PhD time. This was part of my PhD as well.
Yeah, great. And now you are located at the University of the Faroe Islands, and also with a connection to the Southern Danish University.
Yeah, I'm professor at these two universities at the moment.
Yeah, great. And thanks for joining us here and talking us through this paper that you did together with two other professors highly recognized within the physiology of soccer, Peter Krustrup and Jens Bangsbo. If we go to the first, you could say, part of the results slides here, then maybe you could take us through the main findings of this paper.
Yeah, I can start by touching a little upon on the method that we used, because this was before automatic tracking systems, before the GPS systems and these types of technologies that teams are using on a regular basis today. So this was a method where we had individual video recording of soccer players during games. So we had one camera per player, and then we had a system that was developed by Jens Bangsbo and some people with technological skills that developed a system where you train yourself to define those categories or define those runs that players are doing in the game. So basically, it's a subjective system where you rate the intensity of the runs. So you sit with your computer and you press 1 when they are standing still, you press 2 when they are jogging, and so on. 9 when they are sprinting.
But as I know, it has afterwards been validated against the GPS systems and against the automatic tracking system or semi-automatic. And
yeah, it has been validated. This is a study that we did some years ago, and we see quite maybe surprisingly that this is a subjective system. Really strong relationships between the absolute numbers, and when we look at the development of like the intensity changes during the game, we actually find similar results, both absolute level, but also but especially in relative terms.
No, but I remember you sitting doing these, and I mean, it takes what 10 hours to analyze one match, one player.
Yeah, it took hours, and before we did this, we actually had to train. So you had to do the same game again and again so that you could reproduce the results within quite some strong criteria that we had in those days. So we became really good at doing these types of analysis. But it was, as you said, it was extremely time consuming compared to what.
So a large effort behind all these 3,000 citation in order to explore also this focus on the high intensity part.
Absolutely, yeah. But
I highlighted the high intensity because that is what has received, and as I also see this paper, I mean, paving the road for both coaches and also all these automatic analyzers, primarily today focusing on the high intensity and the sprinting part. Is that correct?
That's correct, because before this paper, there was some initiatives. Actually, the first match analyzing paper was published by Ben Saltin in 1973, looking at total distance covered alone, more or less. Then there was some good initiatives from Tom Riley and his group in also in the 1970s, and then Jens Bangsbo came with this method in the early 90s, and had published some results on comparing high intensity running in the first and the second half, and comparing differences between playing positions, but nobody had actually looked at intensity changes throughout the game, and focusing on within game changes, and having the main emphasis on the high intense work of the game. So this was what it brought to the table of new findings.
Yeah, and the figure over here to the right, the figure 3, both, so to say, show the difference between the very top level and the you could say more mediocre levels and so on. In absolute terms, how much have these numbers changed since that time until today?
They are actually quite similar if we look at the most used match analyzing systems. In this paper, we had high intensity running defined as everything faster than 15 kilometers per hour. Most teams of today are using higher categories, so above 90 kilometers per hour and so on. But if we go down to these, if we use the same categories, the numbers are quite similar actually, and that may be because that we are in this paper. I think we are overestimating the sprinting categories, because we have quite a high number or high threshold for sprinting, 30 kilometers per hour, which is markedly higher than the average sprinting speed in a game, because in soccer, obviously, you do really short sprints, meaning that you very rarely get into the really high categories.
But it was my impression actually that the matches or the players has also become better at covering these very intense actions, and especially in the top leagues, that was something that discriminated them. But you say that it's not that much of a change.
There is a difference, but I think that when we look at absolute numbers, we need to be able to compare the same systems. So looking at the same system, for example, if we look at the English Premier League, for example, we see there's an increase like every year in the amount of high intensity running. So and using the same system, but if we compare these findings to numbers of today, they look quite similar, and that may be because we are in this paper overestimating.
So people have to bear in mind when they extract all these numbers, even if they just watch on television, and especially if they cite your paper, that the absolute numbers should be. How about then the fatigue? I mean, the level of decrease, both from, you could say, we evaluate this both throughout the matches, so as indicated by the red arrow up there, comparing the first 15 minutes with the last, but also, as we will see a little later, if you compare one period with the subsequent and so on. How is it with these fatigue patterns? Are they also comparable? Because, I mean, this indicates that there is a quite large decrease in high intensity running.
Yes, and this is something that is, firstly, I would say that this is team specific, and this is something that we have learned over the years, that the amount of high intensity running and also the fatigue patterns is highly linked to what goes on football wise, or the tactical approach, or the way that you play football. But if we look globally at, for example, all the teams in the league, we see, like the first figure shows, that the first 15 minutes of the game is, in 90% of all the cases, the most intense one. And then there is a gradual decrease during the first half, and then players start very hard again in the beginning of the second half, and then there is a large decrease at the end of the game. So we see that still, but players have become better at maintaining high intensity running at the end of the game. And especially if we look at what has happened during the last years, where you were allowed to make more substitutions, and also that coaches have become more aware of how you can use substitutions to counteract that drop that you have at the end of the game.
And how do you see this? Is this mainly a tactical and a pacing effect, that you really start out hard and then you, for tactical reasons or also for pacing? Because I mean, if we look at it physiological wise, you have a decrease. I mean, if we take players out and do a formal sprint test, for example, they only have a decrease of some 2, 3, 4% or something like that. Whereas here you can see that the sprint distances, they are almost halved.
I think it's a combination. I think it's I think clearly it's a fatigue response, and when we do a formal sprint, as you mentioned, we can also question the validity of that approach. How sensitive is a sprint test to detect that type of fatigue?
Because people get a break before doing the sprint and so on.
So I think, but we have also developed, based on these numbers, a simulated model, so like called the Copenhagen soccer test, where we can simulate some of these activities. And when we look at that, we also see that there are clear fatigue responses relatively early in the game. So I would say that also based on my practical experience, because I've been standing by the pitch line many times, many games, and it's very clear in football. I was also been playing myself that that after this initial, there is also always a very high intensity in the beginning, and then like the game usually develops into like a moderate level, and then you have certain periods that may be intense, that may be very intense and demanding, but not compared to the first 15 minutes. And also when we look at the most intense sequences in the game, they are mainly located in that early phase of the game.
Yeah.
So,
and if we
so
go
I think
to
it's
this,
a fatigue
where
response,
you,
but I also think it has links to tactical factors.
yeah. And if we especially focus on this, then you also have a very nice figure with this, illustrating how the peak period in the game that you here defined as the peak 5 minutes and so on, is followed by a period afterwards. The figure here to the left, the figure 4, with lower intensity. And you say that usually occurs in the first 15 minutes or so.
Yeah, if we have also in one of the papers that you had on the list in the initial slide, we have a very nice figure showing the distribution of the peak periods. Where do they actually occur? And maybe only 2% of the peak periods, the peak 5 periods, occur in the last 15 minutes, while more than half of them occur normally very, very early in the game, in the first or the second 50 minutes intervals.
Yeah.
But I can just explain. You want me to explain this this slide because or this figure because before this paper, or this was the first time that you actually where you actually showed data that fatigue may occur very early in a game, and that this type of fatigue that we in this paper called temporary fatigue, we can discuss whether that's a good term or whether fatigue can be a temporary phenomenon, but some type of transient exhaustion that players are experiencing. So what we did is that we looked at data in 5 minutes intervals, and then we selected for the individual player the peak period, so the period where the players made the most amount of, or the highest amount of high intensity running.
Yeah.
And this is what you can see in the peak, around 200 meters or 220 meters for the top class players, and around 170 for the moderate level players. And then when we looked at the period that follows, so the next 5 minutes, we see that there's a drop, and the amount of high intensity running in that next 5 minutes is statistically lower than the average of the game. So indicating that this is a critical period or maybe a recovery period.
And also, as I recall it, in subsequent studies, you took out players and did a formal sprint test. And the decline there is also larger than the one we see from pre to post match, indicating that these intense period are indeed causing fatigue. And I mean, from my point of view, all fatigue is of course temporary. I mean, but the fatigue that you have following an entire game, I mean, that may last 3-5 days, because I mean, we know that the recovery from an entire match is very long, whereas this one, I mean, some of it will return, because if we take players out or test them after the first half, then their sprint performance is, so to say, back. So that is, of course, the fatigue caused by these intense periods.
Exactly, and this is in that study that you were referring to, Kristrup 2006, also a highly cited paper, which was actually a study that we did inspired by these findings, where we tried to take players out during these peak periods. We took muscle biopsies and blood samples also to try to get a little closer into what goes on physiologically. And we saw, as you mentioned, that that players are actually showing fatigue signs after these peak periods, but when they get to the halftime, they are recovered. So indicating that the physiological mechanisms that are causing this type of fatigue are mechanisms that are likely to have a fast recovery. And this is something that we then have explored further in laboratory settings, trying to simulate.
And what is your impression of the way that the top teams train? Do they train with a high focus on preventing, or you could say making players very resistant to this type of fatigue, or are there a larger focus on preventing you could say, the fatigue caused by an entire match? Where's the largest focus in the way that teams train?
Yeah, I would say that if you go back to 20 years back, when this study was done, I would say that the teams were mainly focusing on that type of fatigue, that the accumulated response to an entire game, while that has shifted markedly, and the main focus of today is, of course, there is also a focus on being good at maintaining performance throughout the game, but there's clearly training has been intensified markedly. Teams train at a much higher intensity, much more speed endurance training, aerobic training with very high intensity, which we know is very efficient to make players efficient in these worst case scenario periods of the game.
So there's a much more focus in terms of increasing, you could say, the player's peak power or peak capacity, rather than preventing you could say, rather small fatigue decline that there is over an entire game.
Yeah, and also if you look at an entire squad, you have 10 outfield players and you have 5 substitutions, and most teams at a really high level, they do real-time analysis, so they get data throughout the game, how the individual player is performing physically, and they have a lot of data to look at how like game profiles of different players. So usually players are being substituted before they reach that fatigue at the end of the game.
And that has also changed. I mean, in the days when you did this analysis, there were like 2 substitutions, and it changed to 3. Or when was that?
I actually can't remember when they chose. At this time, it was 2, and then they changed it. I can't actually remember. It was leading up to a World Cup, maybe around 12 years ago. It changed to 3, and now during the Corona period, something that we actually have been shouting about for decades, that should be more flexible with substitutions. This was finally made, and this has given teams a very high flexibility to use substitutions in a tactical manner.
Yeah, and maybe also you could say then there has to be even further less or reduced the focus on the fatigue caused by an entire match, and so. But still, I mean, half of the players has to complete the entire match.
Yeah, but those half players that are completing the entire match are usually the central defenders, the central midfielder, the number 6, those types of players that have a very little fatigue response. So the players that you substitute are usually midfield players that have many long runs, wide
that.
midfield players, and attackers. So,
and that is also something that has developed since this paper, is that there's become a lot of this analysis with focus on position-specific patterns and so on, whereas you show the average here.
Yeah.
Exception for the goalkeeper, I guess.
Yeah, there are also people are also becoming better now at analyzing the goalkeeper and using. There are also been developed certain or specific systems for goalkeepers for goalkeeping analysis.
But also, as shown over here in the figure 5, and of course emphasizing what you're saying, is that of course there's a difference between those who has been substituted and maybe develop less fatigue, and they then cover more distance in the end of the game. And it's clear that if half of the team is then substituted, then that may also, of course, affect the entire picture that will be seen in today's games.
Yeah, so this was actually also, I think, the first data that was shown on substitutes, and again here focusing on what goes on in the last 15 minutes of the game. Figure 5 showing that high intensity running is markedly higher, or 25% higher for the substitutes in the last 15 minutes than it is for the regular players. And if we look at sprinting in relative terms, it's even higher, around 60% higher for the substitutes.
Interesting. Now, we already touched some about that what has changed the methodology for investigating this. I mean, you had around, how was it, 200 and something matches analyzed here, and if that takes 10 hours, then I can quite fast calculate that that's more than 1 year of work for one person, if you estimate that a person works around a little under 2,000 hours. I mean, we are researchers, so of course we work all the time. But then today, I mean, you can produce these mass numbers. So therefore, of course, you can get the data in, as you said, in real time. So I mean, that's impressive, and of course allowing a much larger numbers and investigating patterns and so on. And then there's of course the change in the numbers of substitutes. Are there other things where you have seen that? Then you say the focus in the training, where the physiology and the fatigue and the difference between higher, has it been equalized? I mean, I also remember in the older days that some leagues, they were much inferior compared to the top leagues. Has that also equalized between leagues?
Yeah, I think that I can start with the last question that you had. You had many questions. So last one about how does it look when you look at different leagues. And in this study, we looked at one of the best teams in the world playing in this Italian Serie A. Really high performing team with national team players from the best national teams in the world. And we compare that to players in Scandinavia. And at that time, I would say that the difference in professionalism between the top or the top of the world and for example, Danish and Swedish and Scandinavian teams was markedly higher than it is today. So I think that if we look at the difference that we see between these top class players and the moderate level players is not the same today. It's less. And we also know that in this study, we focused on one team. And since then, many other people have published papers comparing different leagues and so on, and comparing different teams. And we see that it's extremely team specific. So for example, you can be a very technical team like Barcelona was years ago when they had when Guardiola was the coach. They played a type of football that where they dominated, where they were in ball possession the entire time. And a team like that is superior in winning the ball and having the ball, they may not be pressed or taxed to the same degree like a team that is defending throughout the game. Since
So
that,
you're saying that being a superior team doesn't per se turn out in the numbers that you had at that time?
No. So, and this is also if you compare a really extremely good team against a more low-ranking team, for example, in Champions League games that we see, or even the top and bottom teams in different leagues. The top teams of the world may be that superior that they don't have to utilize their entire capacity because they are dominating.
But are there still some physiological factors, some activity where you could say that the best are, so to say, superior in terms of?
Yeah, that's like top speed is normally. Now I'm also part of the Faroese national team, so we also get numbers when we play teams that are at a higher level, and some of the. If we look at those numbers, for example, we see some of the same patterns that we are really good to keep up in general intensity. But when we look at the really quality work with, like you see in sprints, in really high intense and maybe decisive actions, those teams that have that are at the highest level, they are superior in peak.
No, but that also you could say emphasize your previous point that there's been a change in the focus on increasing the peak power and the peak capacity. And you say that is especially in the, you could say, peak acceleration and in peak speed, because
Yeah.
I mean the sprints are so short and that's still the finding? I mean, as I recall the finding from these, then the average sprint is like 2 seconds or something like that. And then you can say if you're fast, then that's somewhere between 15 and 20 meters. Has there been a change in that, in the length of the sprints, or are they still very short? And
they are still very short in general, but then we see certain teams because there was always a development of the game. So, for example, some years ago, if we look at Liverpool, they started to play with many counterattacks, and they had individual players in that team that did many really long sprints. So it varies, it changes, it's very dependent on also whom you are playing. So one thing is
and there's also been a change that today you can analyze not only the speed categories, but also you can, so to say, quantify accelerations.
Yes, you can quantify accelerations and decelerations, and we don't have that many numbers to compare with if we go back in time. If we should look at how these figures have developed, but I would reckon that this is an area because of more intensified training, but also more systemized strength training, that this would be numbers that have been maybe had the greatest development over the years.
Yeah. And what is your take? I will have a later talk with also Jens on what types of testing that you do in formal testing and so on. But one of the things that you can say that this types of studies has also paved the road is that you get an explorer. I mean, you get a massive data on peak sprint speed, numbers of acceleration, total distances, etc., from all of these match activities. Can that substitute for formal testing? Because I mean, you can extract all of these data, so you get, so to say, the competitive performance of the players.
I would say yes and no to that question. I would say that we get a lot of numbers, and obviously this is something that you do as a coach or as a fitness coach. Also, is you look at the training responses and you use those numbers to get a feel of where the player is, and you can compare the players to how he looked in standardized drills. So if you have standardized drills that you are performing on a regular basis in training, and you also have your match data, you can clearly get an impression of where the player is. But but if we want to be really specific on where a player is. I would still say that it's important to do some formal types of testing, but it's extremely difficult in top class football today because of the large increase in number of games, the large increase in time spent on training. If we just look at from 2001 and towards the dates towards current time, there is a 2.5% increase or 2.5 fold increase in time spent on games and training, only in a few in this short period. So it's really difficult to find time where the players are recovered and ready to be tested. But
yeah.
So I would say that you have to try to find certain times where you can test some of the players, for example, the substitutes that are not playing that much. But those players that are playing a lot, I would say that it's also important to do some testing in the game or in the training.
Yeah, because there's a certain reservation for doing these maximal efforts to, I mean, the risk of injuries and so on. But what you're saying is that if you have a type of drill in your training where you say, okay, this is emphasizing, let's say, peak sprint and so on, then you can compare the numbers extracted from that drill and compare it to the match performance, and then maybe also get some kind of impression on whether the players are performing close to their peak.
Exactly, yeah, yes.
And that is more done than I mean doing formal, let's say, an arrowhead or a change of direction speed test, or a straightforward sprint test.
Yes, it is.
No, but that sounds reasonable, especially since you get such rich data from the matches.
Yeah.
From this.
Yeah, it's a completely different world today, and one of the things that has changed a lot is that when you started to get physical data, that was a great advancement. You get when the semi-automatic systems came and GPS systems, you got a lot of physical data, but now most teams are using integrated systems where you get from the same system, you get technical data, you get event data, you get tactical data and physical data. So a lot of the emphasis has now been on having an integrated approach, so where you try to understand what, like, the tactical or the football specific performance based on an integration of all of these numbers. So what causes what is the hen, what is the egg? That's an ongoing discussion. But
yeah, and of course you still need to dig into the physiology, and then if you want to understand how we then change it, because I mean you only get the external data from these types of.
Yeah, absolutely, and I can reveal that there is a paper being written now on where we have made a simulation model of the peak periods, and then we have compared the muscle physiological response to a peak period that occurs early in the game compared to one that occurs at the end of the game. Looking at if you get the opportunity to take part in a peak period very late in the game, how will you perform and how will you respond muscle metabolic wise? So this will be quite interesting.
Still some focus on the, you could say, the longitudinal fatigue and not only the capacity and so on. Yeah.
Yes.
No, but I think it's been a very interesting talk, Magni, and I think that this paper, I mean, of course, you always stand on the shoulders of former workers such as Bengt. I didn't actually know that it was him who did the first analysis of football. I knew that he was interested in skiing and has done a lot of impressive. And then, of course, Jens, who introduced this system and was you could say, together with you and this paper, where he is, of course, the senior editor, this focus on the high intensity part and the fatigue development. And I think it has paved, of course, I mean, from match analysis, the use of that data and how to integrate it in training. And it's probably also why this paper keeps picking up citations. 100 during the last months, because I mean it has become a classical paper in the physiology. And then of course, as we learned from you, we still need to take into account how these numbers have changed by the systems that you use to analyze as categories, which are, as I always see it, it's quite funny that I mean, how did you define these categories? I mean, oh, a sprint, that's 27 kilometers an hour or 30 or whatever it is. Was that just arbitrary set, or how are these?
Yeah, I think this was something that Jens was the first to introduce. We had the paper that you mentioned by Ben. This was a study that Ben did to understand the glycogen metabolism during a soccer game. So he had this very simple approach how to get some type of performance measure. I think it was counting steps that he used as measure of performance, or that was his tracking approach. But it was a primarily muscle glycogen approach, or a study that he did in 1973. And then there was the Riley group that did their studies, but Jens was actually the first that started to look at the intensity and trying to define these intensities. And this was based on...
And also using the video time motion.
Yes, yeah, exactly. And this was done by looking at treadmill speeds and in relation to physiological exertion. So this is why the 15 minutes threshold for high intensity running, this was something that was derived from testing elite players on a treadmill, actually, which is a completely different type of running, but that was what was possible at
so
at
we
that
have
time.
gone from counting steps to time motion analysis of video to today, where you can use GPS and automatic tracking systems and so on. But the fatigue patterns are still somewhat similar, and the amount of high intensity, and that is only a small part of the game, but indeed highly decisive, and also decisive, of course, for the fatigue patterns, because I mean you rarely get exhausted from standing and walking.
Yes, and I can say that if I should give some advice to people that are using these types of systems on a regular basis, is that we are indeed using these systems to understand physiology, to understand physical exertion and fatigue, and this is why we must try to link these numbers to real physiology. Because when you get everything for free, you just get the numbers immediately after or during. You get maybe a focus on the numbers that maybe that you stop questioning what these numbers actually are representing. So this is something I think people that work with tracking data should remind themselves on a regular basis.
That, and then be happy that they get the data and don't have to spend 10 hours for one player.
Exactly.
Yeah, great. Well, it's been really nice talking to you, Magni, and running through this, as I have defined it, high performance paper, focusing on high performance in elite players. So thank you very much. And if people out there are more interested in the paper, there will be a link that you can find to the original, and you can dig into the paper and read it with all the things we've been discussing here in your mind. So thank you very much, Magni.
Thank you, Lars.